Good afternoon, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. We are thrilled to have you join us for our first webinar in the series, Keys to Early Season Soybean Success. And this is hosted by the United Soybean Supported Science for Success team. My name is Rachel Vann, and I am the Soybean Extension Specialist at NC State University. And I am joined by my colleagues from all across the United States. The Science for Success team has 22 states represented, and we work together to collaboratively deliver soybean best management practices. And speaking of our states, the first thing we'd like to do in this webinar is kick off a poll so we know what states all the attendees here today represent. So we are starting this poll. What state are you from? And we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond to this poll. The Science for Success team collaboratively delivers soybean best management practices to U.S. soybean farmers using a variety of mechanisms. One of the things that we do is we summarize existing and ongoing state-supported soybean research and leverage our knowledge that we have as agronomists in our individual states to create national extension publications. And the focus of the webinar today is one of those national extension publications we released earlier in 2023. We also collaboratively deliver best management practices through conducting common protocol research trials across the US annually, and those range on a variety of topics, anywhere from N fixation to foliar fertilizers to soil health or biological seed treatments. And so that's another mechanisms by which we deliver best management practices. So at this point, I'm going to end the poll and share the results about where folks said they were from. And we have folks from all over the United States present at the webinar today, and hopefully you can see some of these results. So with that, we would like to kick off the webinar, which is focused on when early planting doesn't work out. Do I replant, repair plant, or leave this pitiful stand? And our facilitator for our webinar today is Dr. Shawn Conley, the soybean specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's joined by our colleagues, Dr. Lindsey at the Ohio State University, Dr. Jeremy Ross, University of Arkansas, and Dr. Singh at Michigan State University. And our goal is to have regional representation for the soybean producing regions across the US. So at this point, I will kick it over to Dr. Shawn Conley to facilitate this webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Vann, and welcome everyone. And I'd like to echo Rachel's welcome to St. Patrick's Day. As you can tell by name, my name's Shawn Conley. I'm about as Irish as they get, and I know everyone is Irish today. So hopefully you'll be able to go out and enjoy some corned beef and cabbage. I've got that in the crock pot right now, so when I get home, I'll be able to experience that myself with my family. So as we get kicked off today with this whole question about replant decisions and when do we repair plant, or when do we, start over from scratch? One of my questions I always ask people is, at what plant stand do you need to basically consider this action? Either when do you pull the trigger of either starting over from scratch or filling in some holes? So what I want to do right now is take a minute and kind of poll the group out there, because I know we have participants anywhere from Louisiana to North Carolina, Ohio to North Dakota in here today. So I think we're going to start a quick poll and ask you all, when do you decide to make that decision to go through and make that stand when you replant, and what's the threshold for you on your farm? And as that poll information comes in, I think one of the things we need to consider is, first thing is, how do we assess that amount of loss? And I remember back when I was younger, we would always have the hula hoop method when we used to have narrow rows. We have to understand the area of that circle. As we've gone to wider rows, we've gone to utilize more of pulling a tape a certain distance either in 15s, 20s, 30s, or 38-inch rows, depending on where you are across the country. But as we've adapted to new technologies, we have things such as BeanCam. It's a free app you can download on your iPhone or Android to take pictures. Or now we've moved to some of these in-season sensors, either mounted directly on a sprayer or utilizing a drone. So there's lots of different areas here. So what I think we'll do is just kind of get a sense right now if we're to kind of end this poll. And it looks like a majority of those in the audience are roughly, the replant threshold is at 70 to 80K. So that's kind of a threshold that we see out there across the country. And I think what we can do is look at where we are, and it kind of matches what we've been doing. So either our recommendations have been heard or we're listening to your recommendations, because we kind of align. And for the most part, in the southern part of the country, by that I would say I-70 and south, most farmers and agronomists are looking in that 50 to 60,000 plants that are evenly distributed. That's where that kind of a threshold is. And as we move further north into Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota, we're looking more at that 75,000 plants per acre. It's kind of that threshold where we've been able to do that. And then it's funny, if we look here at some of the farmers and crop consultants, I think we would all agree that that threshold has changed quite a bit, given today's modern genetics and how early we're planting. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that as we go through today's webinar. The next question we says, okay, obviously it's usually not a uniform stand. So how do we assess that pattern of loss? And generally what we look for is we consider an action, and that action is either replanting or filling in a thin stand in that 6 to 10 square feet size. So if we have holes that big, that's generally where that action threshold is established in. So I think there's a lot of things to consider when we're making this decision to repair plant. By repair plant, that's the definition we're using here, is you plant into an existing stand or we start over. I think the first thing we do is look at the plant's ability to recover. What's the calendar dates? What are the weed management implications? Seed availability. What is that cost that you as a farmer is going to incur versus what's going to be covered with crop insurance? And ultimately, we have to bring that all in and look at that yield penalty and how does that pencils out. So these are the big points we're going to kind of walk through today. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. When we're done today, I'll be moderating this session, and I'll ask the panelists to be able to go through across the different regions to address any questions you all might have here in the audience today. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is the existing plant's ability to recover. And again, we have to understand that soybean is kind of an interesting crop in that it has a significant amount of phenotypic plasticity, that it's able to regrow, grow into areas and kind of fill in gaps. And on the simplest terms, if we look at this plant right here, and this is a VC plant, we can see here we have the cotyledons and the unifoliate leaves. And if you look at this plot, the plant, in the simplest terms, we actually have 5 growing points effectively happening on this plant. We have here the terminal meristem, but then in each one of these leaf axils, we have axillary meristems. That way, if we have any damage to either the apical meristem, we lose in the unifoliate leaves, or the stem above the cotyledons, we can get regrowth at any one or each one of these different leaf axils. And I think that's the important thing to understand, is that plant's ability to recover. And I think we've seen this with frost injury, with wildlife or insect damage, broken plants through making a pass across the field, with equipment specifically going out there and maybe filling in some thin areas. But if we break the stem above the cotyledons in these early vegetative growth stages, there's generally no yield loss associated with damage at that point. We've done a lot of work across the country with insurance companies and looking at, implementing damage. So again, for the most part, we generally see very little damage or yield loss in the vegetative growth stages, to be it frost or insect damage or chemical drift, as long as the axillary meristems at the cotyledons or above remain intact. One of the areas that we can see damage occur is in flooding, specifically in the southern, but even in the north, the flooding impact. Now, a lot of that is dictated by the duration of the flooding and how warm it is at that time. And I know breeders in the Mid-South and South have put a lot of energy and emphasis into developing flood-tolerant varieties that can withstand 3, 4, 5 days of submergence. So I think there's a lot of things to think about, but if we just really focus in on understanding the plant phenology and where these meristems exist, it really helps us go through and make that assessment of what that yield loss may actually occur at different vegetative growth stages. And then ultimately, what really has been driving part of this is what is the impact of calendar date. And if we see this is some data we've collected across the north central region, from both North Dakota all the way down to Ohio and Nebraska to Michigan, and looking at what is the impact of planting delay on yield penalties. And if we see here, for most of our locations, we're starting somewhere by between April 10th and April 25th for planting dates. And we see anywhere from a 1.4 bushel per acre per week yield penalty by delayed planting, all the way up to a 2.8 bushel per acre per day planting. So the reason we bring this to your attention is, unless there's some pretty significant damage, we really strongly encourage farmers to plant into an existing stand. And the reason for that is, even if you've got 35,000, 40,000 plant stand out there, those 40,000 plants are going to have a higher yield potential because they're planted anywhere from a week to 2 weeks earlier. So again, that's why we're really pushing farmers to not go through and start over from scratch, but go in and plant into an existing stand. So there's a lot of other caveats that are involved with this, and we'll kind of try and cover all those. And the next caveat we're going to be talking about is weed management. So at this point, I'd like to bring in Dr. Jeremy Ross from Arkansas, because they have all sorts of fun weeds that they get to deal with in the South and Mid-South. So Jeremy, they're all yours.
Appreciate it, Shawn. And yeah, this is probably one of the biggest questions I get every spring is on, what do I need to do with my stands if I've got, a reduced plant stands in my fields. But, the biggest issue that we probably deal with here in the Mid-South is our weed management and trying to, really control the weeds, and especially in situations where we have, canopies that are less than ideal is not fun. And sometimes it costs a little bit more money. And so, when we're looking at the weed situation, we don't have these complete canopy closures. They may be delayed or never reached. And so, when we're looking at our weed management issues in these open canopies, more light is able to penetrate that canopy and reach the soil surface. And so therefore, more than likely, we're going to have a bigger problem with, trying to control those weeds if we haven't had a really good canopy closure. So when we're looking at that, we may have to come back in with additional applications, and that's going to cost us more money. We're going to have to be more timely with those applications, and so we're really going to have to be scouting these fields and make sure we get those weeds under control, because there's a whole host of research out there that shows that weed competition can really affect our final yields, especially with Palmer amaranth and some of our more common weeds that we tend to have to really combat throughout the season. Some other things that we need to consider, especially when we're looking at these open canopies, is in our irrigated fields, the irrigation efficiency is going to be less in these fields, just because, again, sunlight is able to penetrate that canopy and we're having more evaporation. So therefore, our efficiency is going to be reduced. We're going to have to spend more money and more time on trying to irrigate these fields to make sure we got adequate water available out there to really maximize that crop. And then, and then here in the Mid-South, especially once we get later in the season, corn earworms tend to want to focus on fields that have open canopies. And so therefore, if we have a field that has open canopy, we may need to scout those fields a little bit earlier. We may need to come back in and treat those fields earlier than normal if we had a complete canopy closure. And in some situations, we may have to put on multiple applications of an insecticide just to try to control that particular pest. And then the next thing we really need to kind of, ask ourselves is, if we do have these problems, what is the seed and the variety availability once we get into the planting season? And so, if we're looking at, a free or reduced cost replanting situation, we need to question, how long is it going to be before we can actually get that seed on the farm and into the planter to try to, either fill in or come back in with a replant. The longer it's delayed, as Shawn just showed in the slide on the planting dates, as we delay planting, our maximum yield is reduced. And so if it's going to take us 2 to 3 weeks to get this seed in, we're just, we're losing maximum yield, and we may not be able to maximize, what we have out there. And then the question is, especially on some of our more popular varieties, can we even get the seed that we planted? Many times, especially on some of these more popular varieties, some of the newer varieties, they may be spoken for, and we're not able to get the exact variety that we planted originally and come back in with a replant. So we really need to kind of look at, other varieties and try to, find the best, the best options that we have available out there. And, probably the biggest question that I get is, if we do have to come back in and either fill in or come back in with a replant, what maturity groups do we need to look at, to try to have an even harvest? And so really that's a hard question to answer, because depending on, how long that original planting has been emerged and growing, and then when we can come back in with that second or the fill-in planting, it's really difficult to really try to mix and match different maturity groups to really get a good even harvest. And so typically, you want to try to stick with, something that's pretty close to what the maturity group was that you originally planted in that field. And then probably the biggest thing, and I've seen this happen in the past, is we really need to confirm, what herbicide traits we have. And so we don't want to mix and match our herbicide traits, especially if you're talking about, the dicamba and Extend Flex technology versus the Enlist, because, there are certain herbicides that will, kill different technologies. So we need to really confirm that we have the proper herbicide technology in there. And then probably the biggest thing we need to keep in mind is a lot of our pre-emerge herbicides have, maximum use rates throughout the season. And most of the time we, reach those use rates, early in the season. And if we have to come back in with a replant, some of those herbicides we will not be able to use just because we've reached the year-long use rates for that particular herbicide. So we may have to mix and match, look at other different herbicide technologies and other different herbicides if we do have to come back in and look at a replant situation. So now I'd like to pass it off on to Dr. Laura Lindsey at the University or the Ohio State University.
There you go.
Take it away,
the
Laura.
Ohio State.
The
Yeah,
Ohio
right.
State.
Yep. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to join the webinar today. When you're thinking about replanting soybeans, there are several questions you need to ask yourself, and maybe reach out to others and ask questions about, is your seed covered? So you may need to reach out to your seed dealer to see what your options are for even replanting soybean in your field. And there are a lot of additional costs to planting: time, labor. What was your seed treatment? We know seed treatments can be very costly, so this is another factor that needs to be considered. Oftentimes in Ohio, when we plant really early, so maybe end of March, first week of April, oftentimes our stands are reduced. They could be anything between soil crusting, slugs, diseases, wet weather, multiple problems that can all occur. But with these earlier planting dates, you may need to check your insurance coverage to see what is indeed covered for you based on your planting date. Go to the next slide. Perfect. So this slide shows a couple of figures from Dr. Shawn Conley. So if I mess up the explanation, you can feel free to ask him questions during the Q&A session. But basically, as farmers, you have multiple fields that need to be planted, and you also have to decide planting priority, corn or soybean. So both crops do have reductions in yield for delayed planting. This first figure here shows projected gross return for corn and soybeans. And basically this information is based on modeling and fields in Wisconsin, so it may not be applicable to every state in the same way. But basically in Wisconsin, what they saw with this modeling effort was soybeans really should be planted first before corn until a certain date. And so that date is about date 112, and that corresponds to April 22nd. Once you hit April 22nd, it's better then to switch and plant corn. And really that's because of the second figure here. So with both crops, corn and soybean, yield does decline as you plant later, but that decline is steeper for corn compared to soybean. So when you're thinking about replanting, also think what other crops need to be planted that year and what fields have yet to be planted. And just anecdotally, in Ohio, I talked to a farmer earlier this week who had a poor stand last year. He said it was the ugliest yield ever, but he didn't replant right away because he had other fields that needed to be planted. So he went and he planted his other corn fields, his other soybean fields. By the time he circled back to replant, he felt it was too late and he just let the field go. And then he told me that that was one of his highest yielding soybean fields. So having that earlier planting date and maybe not great stand, oftentimes will be more beneficial than having a later planting date and a perfect stand. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Singh. Manni is the soybean, cropping system agronomist at Michigan State University.
All right, thanks, Laura. I'm gonna try to take it home here. And I think a lot of the points I'll talk about have been covered by others, right? And in terms of answering this question of cost of doing nothing, I think the key is our recommendation has always been, wait at least a week or so, right? The stand might be looking pretty ugly out there, as Laura was just talking about that example of a farmer from Ohio, right? Waiting is very critical, and then going back and scouting that field before we decide, what to do. And that's where probably are we gonna do nothing and leave it what we have out there, or are we gonna go ahead and do a repair plant, or do we have to replant, right? And this again, do nothing sort of goes against human psychology. I have been guilty of probably that as well. You go out and your plots are looking really bad, and you don't want them to look bad because you don't want the next door person thinking you're not on top of things, right? As a researcher, and I'm sure it's true for you all as well as a farmer, right? But if we really are keening on this profitability piece at the end of the day, right? What is going to maximize dollars in the pocket? I think waiting and scouting that stand is really critical in terms of making that decision, what to do. And even if we are leaving what we have out there, there are other things we can do management wise, right? Jeremy was talking about that. We might have these open canopies, especially if we are in like a 30-inch row spacing, right? And we might have to change our herbicide program, right? So scouting and maybe changing other management based on what we have out there might trump needing to replant, because again, I think Shawn touched on that. We are again pretty much a race against time there, right? Every extra day, we are getting that delayed planting penalty, and it's not linear that the response, right? The further delayed we are, the more bushels we are losing. So again, I think that the key message here is think about profitability and maybe not go to the field for a couple of days because it might look ugly out there. Next slide, Shawn. So again, I think this figure, a couple of images here sort of talks about that point I was trying to make here. This is a couple of pictures from Shawn's plots out in Wisconsin, where you can see what the stand is looking like at really low population, around 40,000 seats versus a relatively high stand, 140,000 or so. If you can see some of the numbers down here at the bottom, they are tracking how much canopy closure was out there based on when the pictures were taken, right? And you can see early on in early June and even towards end of June, there was a difference. that lower seeding rate has a less canopy cover. But by the time we roll towards the middle of July, that's when we want the canopy to be closed, right? It's ideally by the time maybe we start pod formation. And you can see by the mid-July or so, both canopies are closed, right? We are intercepting almost 99% of light out there. So again, how does this look like for a given farmer? That's kind of tricky. And again, our recommendation generally is leave a strip out there. Just like if we are recommending a relatively lower seeding rate, we will ask people, the optimal rate maybe depends on your yield limiting factors in your field. So leave a couple of strips out there if you decide to do nothing, because again, if we do replant or repair plant, that does cost us money. And even if you have some insurance, there is still time involved. And then there's equipment and other depreciation cost, right? So again, soybeans can be pretty forgiving. Others have touched on that, and I will re-emphasize that, right? Due to that phenotypic plasticity, we sometimes just need to give them a little time and see how things are looking out there. All right, so just to wrap it up, I think we want to leave plenty of time for questions here. As I think everyone has emphasized, a lot of times the best decision might be doing nothing, right? Again, it goes against human psychology, but a lot of universities, states are finding that out in their research that might be the best case in general. If we are below some thresholds, it's very critical to know these thresholds. The poll Shawn put out showed the 70 to 80 number, right? It might vary based on where you are. So based on that, the next best option might be to repair plant. And only in very few cases, the replant is probably going to be beneficial. And if you're way below that threshold, that again is going to be economically profitable as well. So just I think sort of thinking step-by-step approach of what decision to make while keeping the profitability piece at the top is critical. And you can see a couple of other information over here. You can see the QR code. I assume we'll put a link in the chat box here. This will take you to this publication that we did here a couple of months ago, working as a group that Rachel was talking about, and it has data from multiple states, and it really focuses on a lot of things that we discussed here in terms of when do we make these decisions, leaving the stand it is and going for repair plant or going for a replant. So I'll highly recommend you to check that out.
Excellent.
And with that, yeah, I'll turn it back to you, Shawn.
Thanks, Manni. Laura, Jeremy, and Manni, I'll be facilitating the questions in the Q&A right now, and I'll encourage all of the participants, if they have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And what I'll do is I'll kind of read each question, then I'll identify a speaker to cover those. And then if either one of the other two would like to jump on in and add more context, especially given the areas that we're covering from the south, mid-south to the north, I think there's a lot of variation we could see that might be of interest for the audience. So the first question that we had is, what is your recommendation on a relative maturity for early planted soybeans? So I guess it comes back to that question. If you're planting your beans early, what do you go put an early bean out there? Do you put a late bean, stick with normal? Let's start with Jeremy in the south, and then we'll go to Laura further north. Jeremy, you're first.
Thanks, Shawn. So when we're talking about maturity groups in our early planted system, we've done quite a bit of work. Dr. Larry Purcell did a regional study that was funded by the Mid-South Soybean Board a few years ago. And it's really sticking with our, group fours. We can go with our, a little bit earlier group fours, probably less than 4.5. But, the yield when we looked at 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, really the yield potential was still, kind of in that wheelhouse of our group 4. So I wouldn't go too early. We've got some producers that, grows to maybe late threes. But majority of our early planted stuff is still going to probably be, a point or two off of what you typically want to plant under your full season scenarios.
Yeah, I'll chime in about Ohio. I guess the rule of thumb here is to plant the longest maturing soybean variety that won't die in a frost, right? So that's a little bit challenging because you never know when that frost will be. But basically that's kind of the rule of thumb. The southern portion of the state, group 3s, group 4s are fine. And, in the northern part of the state as well, a group 3 would be absolutely fine. We also encourage farmers, though, to think about their plans after soybean. So in Ohio, farmers may want to go a little bit earlier with their relative maturity. If they want to plant a cover crop or winter wheat or some other fall grain. And I know Manni, he's done some work with relative maturity and planting date in Michigan, so he has more data than me. So I'll let him also talk about this.
Yeah, so as Laura said, we have done some work on that aspect. So again, I think the focus is on the northern production systems, right? That's different than probably what Jeremy was talking. We have seen the benefit if we are pushing planting early. And here in Michigan, I'm talking like last week of April or first week of May. That's where if you go to a longer bean, so what we call a late maturing variety, right? So like in Lansing area where I am, 2.5 is our typical. And we have seen like if you push to maybe a 3 or a max of 3.5, because again, you want it to mature before frost, what Laura was talking about. We have seen that a benefit of increase in yield is coming from more number of nodes and pods and number of seeds per unit area, and then having a longer reproductive phase. So you're getting more beans and you're maintaining their seed weight. But again, that approach doesn't work if you're based on your cropping system, if you're putting wheat behind. And we have, again, a good portion of our soybean area going into wheat. There again, we are now even starting to look in the new project, can we use some desiccants, to sort of take those beans out. We have some work here on dry beans where that has shown some benefit. So that approach has worked for us in our typical planting time. That's mid-May. We generally don't see a relation, much of a relation between relative maturity and yield. But under early plantings, we have seen that and seen a yield bump of anywhere from 2 to 3, 4 bushels, just going with a late bean.
Thank you all. And what I'll do is I'll kind of flip and we'll go north to south with this next question. And the next question is, how does the replant decision, or how is the replant decision affected by row spacing? I guess the question is, if you have 7.5, 15s, or 30s, does that change it, or do we stick with something similar to what we talked about today in this webinar? So Manni, I'll let you kick it off.
So we have done a row spacing study where the question we were asking was, we typically see benefit of narrow rows in like mid planting or especially in delayed planting scenarios, right? So how about early planting, where the idea is if you're in 30 inches, you have seeds closer to each other, right? So they might be able to like push out if there's a soil crust or something. The last 3 years of data, we have seen benefit of narrow row spacing even under early planting. I think the last year we did not, and we had some crusting issues. So I think there's some truth to that, but we have seen benefit of going or staying with the narrow row spacing even under early planting conditions. And another thing we have looked at, I think just on that same topic, if we're planting early, how critical is our seed placement? And I think what we have seen is that in corn, it really pays to have that precise seed placement, right? Singulation and all of that. But in soybeans, they're more forgiving and you don't need a real uniform stand. And again, that comes back to the replanting thing, right? That even if the plants are not at same stage, in soybeans, that's probably okay. So I think my thinking would be to stay with narrow row spacings for early planting and even for a replant.
Jeremy, I'll push it down to the south.
So, when we're looking at, different row spacings, Arkansas and the Mid-South, we're all the way from broadcast to 38, 40 inches on some of our cotton soils. And so we have a, a wide range of different, row spacings that we deal with. And so, if I had my preference, I would be less than 30. We've got a lot of data showing that, we have higher yield potentials on row spacings less than 30. And especially once we kind of get into that 7.5, 15-inch row spacings, even at those reduced plant stands, we can get better canopy closure than we do on something that's, 36, 38. And so, if you are on those narrow rows and configurations, your replant decisions may be a little bit easier to look at, just because you've got, more of the soil covered, on those lower row spacings than you do on something wide. And so, majority, especially, a lot of our rice top soils we're on, 30s or less. And so, I think those decisions are going to be better or easier to answer on the narrow rows than they are on the wider rows.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right, Dr. Laura Lindsey, I'll throw the next one at you because my favorite questions. All right. Do you recommend planting a soybean with seed treatment when replanting? How late into the season do you include that seed treatment?
And that's a really good question, because I did talk about there is a cost with the seed treatment. So someone was paying attention. So I appreciate that. So I think, it depends too, what seed treatment are you talking about? There's different types of seed treatments, and what are you targeting, or what's your problem that you're trying to control? So think about that. In terms of biological seed treatments, you probably don't need that. You can drop that out. There's also fungicides, insecticides. So in the case of fungicides, you may still need a fungicide depending on your soil type and the disease history in your field. So only you really know that. If you have routine problems with Phytophthora or Epithium or one of those diseases under wet conditions, you still may want your fungicide. Although when you do plant later, oftentimes your soil is drier. So it is location dependent and field dependent. So I guess consider, this is my agronomist answer of it depends, but consider what are you targeting with that seed treatment, and do you think you're going to have to target that disease or pest as you plant later, knowing your weather conditions and your field conditions.
Thanks, Laura. Jeremy, I know you're all a little different in the Mid-South. So what would you recommend in the Mid-South for that question?
Yeah, so, our typical recommendation is, insecticide, fungicide, seed treatment, pretty much throughout the planting window. You may not see the benefit, as much in the middle of the planting window, when we have those really good soil conditions and we plant soybeans, good soil moisture, and the beans pop up out of the ground in 4 to 5 days. We may not see the benefit, but really it's where it's on the extremes. Very early plantings, we see a benefit, and then later in the seasons, because then it's kind of like Laura was mentioning, it really kind of depends on the field and kind of the history, because early in the season we're dealing with the Epithiums and Phytophthora species, and so yes, typically when we have our wetter conditions. But here in the Mid-South, later in the season, we deal with our Rhizoctonia, seedling diseases. And so we really try to, try to protect as much as we can on the extremes. But we do have some, soil insect issues that, we've seen a benefit with the insecticide seed treatment. But again, it's kind of on those extremes. If the seed sits in the ground early in the season for, 2-3 weeks, we just need to do everything we can to protect that seed. And then at the end of the season, some of the later season insect issues, soil's gotten a little bit warmer. They're starting to get a little more activity in some of those soil-borne insects. And so we really try to protect them. But, here in the Mid-South, we've got quite a bit of data showing that we can really get some really good impact with insecticide, fungicide, seed treatments.
Thanks, Jeremy. Now I'm going to throw this out to all three of you, and we'll start in the north and work our way south. So the question is, what is the most profitable number of plants for a soybean field, all other things being equal? I'm guessing what the question is referring to is, if you could just go out there, plant what do you need for a stand just to be the most profitable? So, Manni, let's start in the north and work our way south.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think it comes back to a little bit of this field specific aspect too, right? It might vary. The number I think we all used to use was that you have to have 100,000 plants, right? It's probably a good math number, you know, a good round of number. But I think in reality, for maximizing profitability, I think it's less than that. I think it's again that maybe close to the threshold number even we are talking about. We have seen in a lot of our seeding rate trials that as long as we have a stand that's around 80,000 plants, you know, again, uniform distribution of that stand. And you can do that, right? With replant, you might have issues with gaps, you know, because of whatever happened. But if you from get-go, you are targeting around that number, 80 to 100K, I believe that's maximizing your profitability. I don't think it's more than 100K. And we have looked even under early planting conditions, not ultra early, but under early planting, you know, what that number looks like. And I believe since we are dealing with a higher yield potential, that number can be a little bit lower because we have seen that in soybeans, you know, if we have a high yield potential, we can get away with less number of plants. Under relatively low yield potential, that's where we need to be pushing for higher, right? Late planting and even double cropping, things like that. We have seen that the number might be 140, 150K. But I think optimal planting, typical conditions around here, I think 80 to 100K probably will get you maximum dollars. Hopefully I'm close enough to you, Laura.
I was gonna say that's exactly what I would have said, Manni. So I think usually that rule of thumb is you want at least 100,000 plants per acre, but you know, I think if you go down to 80, I don't think there's an issue. But I don't recommend people plant 100,000 because you plant 100,000, you're probably not going to get 100,000. So I usually recommend farmers in general plant 140,000 seeds per acre, and there can be some variability because you want to get to that 100,000 stand. So in soils that might have higher disease pressure or prone to soil crusting, you may need to go a little bit higher. If you have a field with maybe better emergence and conditions, you could go a little bit lower. I've seen in Ohio, sometimes farmers plant 140,000 seeds per acre and soil crusting is an issue, and now they have 70,000 plants per acre. So going a little bit higher with your seeding rate gives you some extra insurance to ensure at least, hopefully you have somewhere between that 80 to 100,000 plant per acre range.
Yeah, I would just the same in the Mid-South. So, you know, Arkansas and Mississippi have done quite a bit of the seeding rate work. And, you know, me and Trent Irby feel real confident that 75,000, you know, uniform plant population is where we can maximize yield. Anything less than that, you know, we start to see a reduction in yield. But the key is uniform, you know, across the field. If you start to get, you know, pickup size truck areas where there's no plants, or you get, you know, 3, 4, 5 foot skips, you know, within a row, that's really where we start to see the impact in our yield. And so as long as it's uniform, you know, I feel confident that 75,000 plants per acre, you know, will maximize yield. But as Laura said, I can't tell you what the seeding rate is you need to plant to get that exactly 75, because you know, each lot of seed, the germ is a little bit different, the vigor is a little bit different, the planting conditions are a little bit different. You know, who knows if we're going to have, you know, a stretch of wet weather after we plant for 5 or 6 days, and you know, we lose some stand, you know, due to seed rot and things like that. So as Laura said, I see, you know, our seeding rate kind of as a little extra insurance. And so, you know, typically, you know, here in Arkansas in the Mid-South, you know, that 140, 130,000 has kind of been where we've been for the last 4 or 5 years. So, you know, 35 or 75,000 be the minimum, but, you know, we could go up to, you know, 100, 120 and still have relatively the same amount of yield. You know, you may see a 1% difference in yield, but, you know, as long as we got that 75,000, I feel confident we can maximize yield.
Excellent. So I'll just throw this one out as just, I want to see if there's any consensus in the group here. At what growth stage are soybeans too large to spot in? Like, is there once they get to a certain stage, say, whatever that is, are they too large? Any thoughts from the peanut gallery? All right, I'll let Manni go first. I guess I should probably assign this so the people aren't waiting. So Manni, you go first and we'll work south again.
Yeah, I don't know. I think to me, I think the yield potential is determined not by the length of the plant, if it's too tall or too small and things like that, right? I mean, I've seen, again, if you are too tall, you can easily get lost. I think you need a good plant that has enough number of notes on it to maximize that number of seeds per unit area. So I don't know. I mean, our general rule of thumb is like before pod filling begins, you want to close your canopy. So I don't know if that's adding much.
I want to say this is a very good question and one that
Yeah.
I have absolutely no data on.
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. I know aside from replanting, so just in general, sometimes you can have very uneven soybean stands where we'll have some at VE and maybe even, you know, V3 in the same field on the same planting date. So there is always kind of that unevenness. Where's the cutoff where that is too divergent? I honestly don't have an answer for that. Maybe Jeremy or you, Shawn, do, but just in general, we'll have soybeans at different growth stages early on in the spring.
Yeah, we did some replanting work a few years ago, and we delayed the second planting by about 3 weeks, and so most of this plants were at that V2, not quite V3. But the challenge you run into is that unless you kind of off center where you're coming back in and planting, a lot of the times you'll destroy quite a bit of the original planting, I guess, coming back and trying to do that replant. So you really need to kind of scooch over a little bit, maybe not come exactly back down that same row, but about that V2 V3 is about probably to cut off of what I would feel comfortable with, coming back with a replant, because if you get much more than that, something's going to act more like a weed than a soybean. You're going to have a lot of competition within the rows and then within that field, with those delayed emergence.
Thanks. That kind of gets into Martha's question here is how do you balance the damage of running over a good stand to fill in our holes? Is there a good time frame, either growth stage or if the plant, how do you all think about that, or what are your recommendations? And we'll go south to north this time.
Yeah, I think I answered that a little bit, but it's hard, trying to fill in those holes, especially in the bottom of the fields. The water got up out of a ditch or a bow or something, and you lost part of the stand on the bottom of the field, pulling in and backing up and pulling in and backing up, just, trying to plant, an acre or two. And sometimes, it's just a challenge trying to fill in, some of these holes and gaps. But the disadvantage of not actually putting in something in there to try to get, soil coverage is you're going to have weed problems, in those areas. And so, depending on how big they are and how challenging they are to get into the field, to get them filled in is probably going to be a field to field basis on that.
I don't think I have much to add on to what Jeremy said, except for it is challenging. But if you do have those big gaps, weeds can really come up and get out of control in those areas. I know equipment size can be really challenging. I was talking to a farmer again, always in Northwest Ohio, where he said that he can't really patch a field and to replant or repair plant because his equipment is too big and he has to just go through the whole thing. But yeah, I agree with Jeremy, and it's a challenge to make those decisions.
Yeah. And I don't think I have much else to add. I think we are getting bigger and bigger equipment every year, right? So I think that's probably making it more challenging. But again, I believe soybeans are more forgiving in that aspect, right? So even if you have variability in the growth stage, I think we tend to see that a lot. So maybe not much we can do about it.
Excellent. So I see we've got like 10 minutes left. So in order to try and get through all of our questions, at least the ones that don't have a lot of overlap, I'm just going to point to an individual to answer it. And then what we'll do is if someone disagrees, which I hope we do have a disagreement, that makes it more fun, then someone can chime in. So question, I will throw this one to Laura. If you offset a replant, how much should you offset to keep from destroying the existing stand? And do you see a compaction effect?
Well, in terms of, I know this is a great question, right? In terms of compaction, that's going to probably depend on your soil moisture, your equipment size, and your soil moisture. So compaction is detrimental to soybean root growth in the field in general. So consider the field moisture in your equipment when you do that. In terms of offset, I'm going to bounce that to Jeremy because he said he's done that and I haven't done that.
Yeah, so, we just moved our planter over, about 2 inches. But again, it all depends on your closing wheels and your disc openers and things like that. So, you may, if you're planting flat, you may be able to come over halfway, over and just come back down the center. If you're on 30s, that means you're just going to have 15. So it all kind of really depends on, what your equipment is and, the wheels and things on your equipment.
Excellent. Here's another question for, I'll go this one to Manni. What are the benefits, if any, of planting soybean using variable rate seeding? So question for you, Manni.
Yeah, Laura and I have done some work on this few years back, and we did see some benefit, but I think that the tricky part is how you design that prescription, right? I think the main benefit to me of variable rate is, I think we have talked about that, what gets us to that final stand, right? That 75, 80, 100,000 plants we are talking about. That's not V2, V3, that's at the time of harvest. And our field might have different attrition rates to get us to that point, right? So we might need to be planting some areas at a higher rate than others. So I think I see the value, and it might be, I think sometimes I even think, maybe we overcomplicate how we design that prescription, right? So just knowing where you have maybe higher attrition, higher stand loss within a field, you bump it up a little bit, and where you don't have those issues, you can drop it down. So maybe buy the bag of seed, 130K or whatever, and drop it in few places, increase it based on, again, here field history, and it probably shows up in yield monitor data. I think that's the best I can think of.
Thanks, Manni. So what we're going to do is some of these questions we have some existing resources for. So we're going to drop just some links into the Q&A just so that we can get to some of the questions we might not have those specific resources for. And there's a couple near the end that are related to soybean traits and repelling deer. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of just put these 2 questions together and I'll throw them out to Jeremy. And then I actually have a comment about this as well. So Reed Pfeiffer asked how much research is being done in an effort to come up with a soybean trait to repel deer. And then in addition to that, Jeff Lambert asked, will soybean plants that have had deer feeding damage to the terminal buds have the potential to generate a full plant canopy from axillary buds and subsequently yield similar to the undamaged areas in the field? So Reed, I'll make a quick question because that's the advantage of having 22 members on the Science for Success team, is that we were together last week in Orlando at the Commodity Classic. And I do know in the Mid-Atlantic, there is actually some state legislation going on to provide growers with some cost share to plant a forage soybean on the headlands and around the field in order to, and these forage soybeans have a higher sugar content, and they actually draw the deer in, so they're only feeding on those areas. So that's something you could talk to or speak with possibly your state, maybe NRCS or other groups to look at there's some cost share programs to that. And I do know that Jeremy deals with some issues we all do with deer feeding. So what are your thoughts about damage and, well, can they generate a full canopy after they pull out that axillary meristem. So Jeremy, what do you think on
Sure.
that?
Well, so on the trait, I don't know of any trait that anybody's looking at, but there are some repellents, but a lot of them were short-lived and really aren't that effective for an extended period of time. But the damage, historically, we can't plant early at our pine tree location just because of the deer damage. If we try to plant early, we're typically the only beans in the county. And so, we've tried, different things, just about everything you've heard of. We've tried. The best option we found is electric fence, but it's a pain to put up electric fence and then take it down to do what we need to do in the plots. But we've had quite a bit of damage over there. Yields are reduced, and it all depends on how much they feed on those plants. If they just feed on it once, and it's able to put on auxiliary buds and more branches, the yields are somewhat typical of what a normal undamaged planting would be. But if they just continue to feed on those plants for extended period of time, I've got data showing that yes, the yields are going to be reduced. And so really, it really depends on how much damage and how prolonged that damage is. But most of the time, it's coming in a little bit later in the seasons where we see the damage, and it really past a point of really looking at a replant.
All right, so in an effort to stay on time, there's 4 minutes left. I'm going to ask one final question, and then I will ask Dr. Rachel Vann to come on and kind of finish this off here. So with that, here's my question, and I'll throw this to Dr. Laura Lindsey because she's been doing some work with biologicals. The question is, if you're tight on time or soil conditions don't permit replanting, are there amendments or other foliar management practices that you'd suggest as a plan B or a get by for management practices to help offset a thin stand?
I guess I will say no. I know that's not the answer that people like to hear. We've looked at foliar fungicides, for example. We have flooded fields and the stand is poor and the soybeans are little, and we apply fungicides, and really it doesn't seem to help. In terms of that silver bullet that can help, I don't really think there's much out there and available. But I think it depends on what your stand is. Some people, you hit 70,000 plants per acre and they get really, really nervous. But I've seen multiple instances on farm where producers may only have 60,000 plants per acre, 50,000 plants per acre. They let it go, and it ends up not yielding as horrible as what they might think. So there is no magic bullet if you can't go out there and replant as far as I'm aware of.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsey. So for those of you that are CCAs, you'll see here your CCA QR code. There's 1 credit, a crop management credit for your CCA. And then if you do not have the app on your phone, we have left an email here for Jenny_Parleo@ncsu.edu. And I will leave this up for a minute, or if you just want to snap a picture, that way you will be able to go through. And what I'll do for the CCAs involved, I'll advance one slide so that Dr. Rachel Vann can finish this off, and then I'll come back to this one so you can get your QR code or the email for Jenny. So I will go advance to the next one, and Dr. Vann, the floor is yours to finish this off.
Great. Well, we again want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We had attendees from 19 different states and even Canada, which we were able to capture in that first poll, and that really represents the wide diversity of geographies that the Science for Success team represent in their applied research and extension priorities. So we'll hope you will join us for the next 2 webinars in this series. The next webinar will focus on planter technologies, and the final webinar will focus on some fertility considerations and nitrogen fixation for soybean planting early in the season. So please plan to join us for subsequent webinars, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Soybean Science 1. We'll be providing updates on production conditions from across the United States and soybean growth and development over the course of the 2023 season. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. And again, we'll emphasize the content of this webinar is available in the extension publication that was released by our team earlier this year. Have a great afternoon, and again, happy St. Patrick's Day.